So we're going to bring on Sujoy Sarkar and Rumi Morales, and I've been waiting for this event for since the last time we spoke, which was a week or so ago, which we did a podcast, and the podcast was sort of a GIC prep call that was supposed to last 15 or 17 minutes. It went on for over an hour. If you guys are interested in learning anything more, I would encourage you to listen to it, because I had to go and listen to it 2 or 3 times. It was pretty fun. So Rumi, I'm going to make a short introduction about Rumi and Sujoy, and then I'll let you guys play a little bit in the sandbox, but I'm going to probably interrupt several times because it's so interesting. I'm going to say, so as Rumi, as I'm reading, it's an early specialist in digital currency and blockchain technologies, which is pretty amazing. Also leading investor and educator on artificial intelligence. Now, I haven't seen those 3 words put together before, nor have I seen robotics and quantum computing. So when we put this together, blockchain, digital currency, educator, artificial intelligence, robotics, and quantum computing.
Yeah.
Globally recognized as a leader in identifying and cultivating the emerging industries that will define our next generation. Sujoy started very early on in developing a company on hedge funds. I mean, you developed the back-end quantitative methodology for hedge funds, which was acquired by, was it Forbes?
Yes, that's right.
The Quantumize was acquired by Forbes. You've been working with investment, JP Morgan, RBC Capital Markets. You've seen a lot of companies go through IPO, multiple IPOs, and secondary offerings totaling over $5 billion. You've led a lot of M&As. You're in search for the next large company, both on broad technology aspects, but also more specifically for your company now, BYTON. BYTON is a car company.
That's right.
So when we have 2 of you with this sort of background, it's amazing. I am so looking forward to this. So when we talk about the theme of our event, so looking at Acorns to Unicorns 2.0, look at some of your backgrounds in digital currencies, blockchain, advancing technologies, companies that we should be paying attention to in the future, the changes that the pandemic has brought to us in the past, and the likelihood that some of the behaviors will carry on for the near future. And look at the global environments that you cover with both of the investments that Outlier Ventures makes, Rumi, and some of the things that you're doing with this very, very hot market at BYTON and electrics and technology and 5G networks. I mean, I have to be quiet now. I want you guys to chat a little bit about yourselves, what you're really excited about in these areas, and then I'll pop in a few minutes to prompt.
Sure, I'll jump in first if that's okay, Sujoy.
Sure.
Because I think I'm supposed to be the one chatting with you. I'll be peppering you more questions since you're the mobility expert with everything that Karim said in the wonderful introduction. This is also supposed to be a panel about mobility and SPACs. So I think we've got to cover a lot. But in terms of blockchain, digital currency, AI, robotics, quantum, like what is that all about, and what's my background? How is my background relevant here? When I said I was my bio says I'm a pioneer, it isn't so much that when I was leading the venture arm of the CME group, we were making investments in these areas back in 2013, 14, 15. I mean, what type of financial exchange is investing in quantum computing back in 2014? We did, because we were looking at the technologies that could become financial technologies over time. If you think about the way that trading used to be done in pits and open outcry with hand gestures, people had been trading like that for 300 years in exchanges. And then in 20 years, it basically changed with electronic trading. Now, what took 20 years is already being changed with digital trading. I mean, the pace of technology innovation is crazy. And I think what's important to note is that no technology exists in isolation either. You are going to see blockchain and AI and IoT all combined. They're going to be converging. And one of the areas that they converge in obviously will be mobility, will be autonomous vehicles, right? If you think about a self-driving car, getting its own electricity and driving away. Like, how does that happen in practice? What financial transaction needs to be made there, right? Does a car care if it's being paid in Bitcoin or dollars or what? You're having a number of technologies, of these advancing technologies, come together. So just like when I was at the CME thinking about what tech can become fintech, those same technologies have applicability to mobility, to smart cities, to digital manufacturing, to so many things that are transforming our economy. So, my background has primarily been in financial services, but it's just wild to think of how many new industries I'm becoming familiar with now as things are converging through technology. Sujoy, I think you might have a similar background in financial services. Is that right? Or you have some background in that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Kareem did a great job of explaining my background. I helped start a quantitative macro hedge fund, really focusing globally on investing in thematic, really themes across what's going on, in specific locations like Latin America, like Asia, and here in the US, of course. And one of those themes was automotives and electrification. We saw this theme going back 2012, 2013 happening in China, with the Chinese government really pushing subsidy capital and really pushing the traditional OEMs to start innovating and electrifying their fleets. If you look forwards today, this is exactly what's happening in China, but also all over the world. And so, exactly what you're talking about, Rumi, my background has really been on the investment side of things, both at the hedge fund where we ultimately sold this to Forbes, but I was responsible for analyzing consumer and tech companies. And then previously to that, I covered tech, media, and telecom and consumer at JP Morgan and RBC Capital Markets. So right now in my role at BYTON, I probably have the best job in the world. I get to travel all over Asia, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East. And I'm looking for interesting technologies that we can either invest in, acquire, or partner. And as you were saying, it's really across automotive and technology. There's a huge convergence happening in the auto tech and mobility world. You talked about, I was talking about electrification, for instance. You were talking about financing, insurance. When we think about smart contracts, for instance, energy storage. There's so much going on here, especially as well with IoT. So all of these industries are coming together and you're seeing a huge convergence. And what's great for the people on this call and the people who are dialing in, both from an investment standpoint, but also from an operating standpoint, is that they're going to be up and coming startups that are driving new spaces, that are really creating completely new products for this industry because it is completely changing. From the investment standpoint, and really where I think many of us stand, there are so many opportunities, and that's what really creates an exciting opportunity for me, at least. You have the private side of things, right, where you have traditional VC-backed companies. Now you're starting to have entities that are going public, either traditional IPO or through SPACs. So we really wanted to talk about both aspects here, what's going on in the future of mobility, but also how SPACs are playing a role. And I know when Rumi and I were originally talking, I think we went on for an hour and a half, so we'll try to keep this pretty short here.
Right. I mean, there is so much to discuss, but let us focus then on the financing side. I think that speaks to both your and my strengths.
Sure.
You mentioned public markets and SPACs, but there are, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about even more alternative methods as well, whether you're going to go the token launch route as well. Absolutely. For these technologies. But I know there's so much interest in SPACs these days. Can you talk a little bit of how you see that market regarding mobility, but I guess more generally with all these technologies that affect various industries, right? So you can talk about mobility SPACs, but as we know, like the tech is also going to be applicable across other industries as well.
Absolutely. And why don't I start with, let's say, the mobility or automotive market? I think traditionally, and again, coming from more of an internet and software background, you can launch a startup with very limited capital, and you can raise those rounds over time, and you can take that traditional path. The problem with automotive, especially when you're building an electric vehicle, is it takes nearly $1 billion just to build a platform, okay? Then when you think about, okay, we finally have a product, we have to come up with different top hats for that product. How do you scale that product, right? When you think about scaling, you have to go through a whole manufacturing process. Do you decide to contract manufacturer? Do you decide to build your own manufacturing plant? Well, if you're building your own manufacturing plant, it nearly takes $800 million to another $1 billion. So you're looking at $2 billion before you're even making any revenue. And that's why the SPAC, process is so interesting to a lot of EV companies, but also really mobility companies. When you think about LiDAR companies, when you think about autonomous driving, when you think about energy storage companies right now. So what's really intriguing here is that the amount of capital that's needed just to make revenue is so high. And that's why you're seeing so many new SPACs come out into the market, and they're looking into the mobility space. You've recently had several announcements from the names of like Lucid, for instance, like Fisker. These are all new EV companies that are coming out, and they're competing against the traditional OEMs. And the question is, how are these new startups really competing against the BMWs, the Daimlers of the world, right? The truth of the matter is the traditional OEMs, a GM, a BMW, a Ford, for instance, they are companies that have legacy infrastructure. And so when you take a company that's existed over 50 to 100 years, it's really hard to really innovate, right? And so that's why you're seeing now all of these startups that are coming up, and they're really focused not only in the electrification space with vehicles. You're seeing eVTOLs, which are flying helicopters, flying drones. You're seeing also innovation happening in the security space right now, because the connected car is really what the future is. And you were talking about smart cities, Rumi. That is the future, and that's where we're going. We need new infrastructure. We need new modals of transportation. And the outcome of this is a smart connected city where all of these industries are really going to be completely redefined. So how do you achieve all of that additional capital, right? Do you go through the traditional VC routes, or do you start thinking about potentially listing, even when you're a pre-revenue company, and that's kind of the interesting, that's the interesting dilemma. It's a chicken and egg issue here. You need to raise significant capital to produce your product, especially as a automotive company. You need to reach that scale as well. But if you don't have capital, how do you do this, right? And that's why you're seeing so many EV companies that are actually going out and doing a SPAC. It's really because it solves those funding issues right away. And they're really worrying about hitting those milestones later on, right? And I think John was doing a good job of explaining, the investors who are investing in this space, especially through the de-SPAC process, they're looking out 4 or 5 years out, looking at what those valuations are. They see the growth in the marketplace. If we just specifically look at the mobility market, for instance, electrification is going to be a $1 trillion market by 2030. Right now, if you just look at penetration, it's nearly 5% of total vehicle sales in 2020. So there's huge, massive growth that's happening. You see this with Tesla, and that's already been valued, not only on the vehicle side, but also on the software and services side. And this is where, at least I believe that's where the true value is. That's where you see companies like Faraday. This is where you see companies like Lucid, for instance, and also BYTON. It's really focused on digital services, and that's where the future is, and exactly what you were talking about with the autonomous driving aspect as well.
Right, absolutely. And for your comment on how much capital is required, as we also know, there, to your point around services and ancillary technology that can go into smart cities and other related growing industries. For everyone that's listening and watching right now and thinking, well, and there's a question in this in the chat and we can talk about is, are SPACs overheated? Like, what are the other ways of getting involved here? I mentioned quantum computing back in 2014. We didn't actually invest in a quantum computer, which is so crazy expensive, but rather in a software company that was writing to the D-Wave machine based in Vancouver. So there are opportunities as well to be able to participate in investing in technologies that are part of the mobility, the greater mobility industry, without necessarily having to go into the capital intensive companies themselves. I can think, for example, of an early technology protocol that we work with at Outlier Ventures, which is the firm I'm a partner of, called IOTA, which had a partnership with Jaguar, right? So IOTA is a type of distributed ledger technology. I think maybe some of you have IOTAs or have participated in that market before, but there are a number of tokenized protocols out there that also have a lot of relevance for the mobility industry. For which you can also be able to invest, whether it is through a blockchain focused fund or directly into the protocols themselves on the crypto markets or in a private sale or what have you. There are any number of ways now through financial innovation that you can take to express your view on the future of mobility. But now to address the question on SPACs again, that was raised by someone in the Q&A, is this overheated? Is this, in your opinion, the best way for a mobility tech startup to come to market through a SPAC, or should we look at some other type of method? Are SPACs overheated? What do we think is going to happen there? What do you think is going to happen there?
That's a great question. Listen, I think you have to view it from different vantage points, right? Is the SPAC bubble overheated? First of all, I do think it is somewhat of a bubble, and I'll explain why. I believe, and again, I'm a history of, I study the markets. I love history. Very similar to you, Rumi. We were talking about this before. The SPAC craze has happened before. There's been a SPAC 1.0 where you had a bunch of companies actually do reverse takeovers previously with companies in China. And what ended up happening was that a lot of these companies that had merged here with what's called blank check companies here in the US, a lot of them were actually lying about their numbers, and they were lying about how much scale they actually had in China. And this ended up being a huge bubble that ended up bursting, and both retail investors, but also many institutional investors had lost a lot of money. So as we look at the new bubble or craze here where it's SPACs, in my opinion, at least, do I think it's overheating right now? No. Do I think it will overheat? Yes. And let me just go into some details here. First of all, you have about, I believe, over 200.
Before you do, I just want to make sure we level set for the whole audience, because there was a question in the Q&A just asking what SPAC stands for. So just to make sure everyone in the audience, the SPAC being a special purpose acquisition company. It's essentially like a shell company, a public company that's set up by investors with the sole purpose of raising money through an IPO in order to acquire a private company. So for many private companies, it can be like a quicker way to an IPO. For many financiers, it's a way to leverage the public markets to be able to then decide what you may want to acquire. We should note that SPACs have been around for a while. This isn't just a phenomenon from 2020 or 21, but they've become increasingly popular in the past couple of years. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted
No, that's exactly right. And I know, some of you might not know what a SPAC is. That's exactly what a SPAC is. Typically, people look at SPACs because it's just a much easier process, to list publicly versus going through the traditional IPO route. It's also cheaper, and you can do it extremely quick. Typically, you can do it in 3 to 4 months with a specific underwriter, for instance. And just going back, actually, that's a really good point, talking about the whole SPACs. Why are SPACs so popular right now? Why are companies, and it's not just happening in the automotive space, it's really happening all across tech. And I believe also in the cryptocurrency space, you're going to start seeing this happen as well. The whole reason for SPACs right now existing is you're taking these entities, which are blank shell companies, as Rumi had mentioned. Typically, they're run by, famous executives. They're run by a seasoned team or investors as well in this space. They raise capital. They raise it through an IPO. And again, there's no operations here. Typically, as part of the mandate, they have anywhere between 24 months, on average, to 36 months to go out and merge with another company. So their entire job is to basically go find a company that they think will be a winner in the future, right? And so this team is typically called the financial sponsor. The financial sponsor is job for the next 24 to 36 months is to go merge with a company. And there's a lot of financial incentives here. Once you actually merge and list that company publicly, the financial sponsor is completely incentivized due to the economic structure. Typically, it's 20% plus all of these warrants. And so if I give you my money to run for 24 to 36 months, I expect a return. I expect you to do something with it, right? Otherwise, I could have made money, as John was saying, invested in some type of ETF or the S&P 500 index, or just invest in it myself. So there is a lot of incentive for these financial sponsors to go out and merge with a company. This, going back to the question, is the SPAC market overheating? Right now, there's about 200 or so SPACs that are out there that are currently looking for companies to go and buy. Now, some of these companies are going to be absolutely strong quality. They are, they're already revenue generating. They're scaling extremely fast. They're going to have multiple catalysts that really help them take a large percentage of whatever TAM that they're going after. those companies, once they go, then you're left with the middle tier and the bottom tier companies, right? And unfortunately, at least in my own personal opinion, there's so much incentive for the SPACs to go out and merge with these companies that that'll end up happening. And what will end up happening is these companies will go public. Many of these companies will not be ready at all, and they're going to fail. And so that will be really the start to what I think will be another SPAC bubble. But at this point, there's just so many SPACs out there that are looking for companies. I don't think it's overheating yet. And again, I've been tracking the space. There are some very strong quality companies that have recently emerged and have gone public. They just need time. And again, you're paying for growth today. So that's really the main difference. Instead of going through the VC route, going through, all of these rounds of funding, getting to that specific scale where you can list. That is really the core difference here.
Right. When I started my venture career, reverse mergers were kind of all the rage back then. And I do see some similarities, and it'll be interesting to see how many people now try to get into SPACs and produce negative, like not the good returns or not the good opportunities we're seeing. And then regulators come in and whatnot. But, my view of SPACs is, like I said, this is not something that just came out overnight. They were created decades ago for a reason. I do think that there are good reasons for them, for this structure to exist. You just hope that it won't be abused too much.
Very good point.
There are some questions in the Q&A. One that, if it's okay for me to take the first answer here, Sujoy, but obviously feel free to jump in, is, will mobility tech startup companies look to come to market via STOs or security token offerings? In this case, I think, well, sure, yes, but if the mobility company is comfortable and has a tokenized, structure, many times there's still regulatory uncertainty as well, and perhaps some mobility companies don't even want to mess with the token markets right now. It's like, why do you need to when they're with SPACs, for example? There are now other forms of financing which perhaps are more clear from a regulatory perspective, arguably, than what you're finding with STOs right now. But I'm sure there are many exploring this opportunity. Certainly at Outlier Ventures, we see tokenized companies all the time, or companies seeking to raise funds through STOs. But I think right now there are just other options available for mobility companies other than having to go on the tokenized route. But
yeah, I would just add that's also a function of the capital needs, right? I actually know a European company, and I probably can't say the name right now, but they were looking at doing an STO, and part of that was they were actually trying to create two aspects. They wanted brand loyalty. They wanted to give something back to the consumers. They really wanted to target it to the retail investors. So again, they wanted institutional capital, which they can do be a typical raise, but they really wanted to build up the number of reservations that they had. And so that's why they were thinking of actually going out and doing the STO. But you're absolutely right, Rumi.
So I think we've just got maybe 4 or 5 minutes left. There is a question about MOBI, which is the Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative. That's a member-led consortium where the members and users are focused on making transportation greener, more efficient, and affordable using blockchain. And the question there is, will this be a critical initiative to bring forth blockchain tech to the auto industry? It is certainly an important initiative. I will say, oh gosh, I hope no one from MOBI will scold me if they hear this, but like many initiatives in the space, it got a lot of press when it started, and then like the new hot thing came around. But I do feel like they continue to do good work. But let's also put our history hats on, right? Sujoy, as you mentioned, you and I are both we really honor history and the patterns of history. Blockchain is still very new. Autonomous vehicles, very new. There is still time, so much time yet, for initiatives, for investments, for so many other things that are going to be required to make this industry as commonplace as it is right now when we just see regular cars on the ground. So yeah, I feel like MOBI can be important, but I think there's still a lot of room for other industry consortiums to get together, for more investors to get in this space. And so then I'll ask you, Sujoy, the question. So what are you looking out for? What are the trends in this mobility, not SPACs, but what are you most excited about when you look on the horizon? What do you think are the great investment opportunities here?
There's so many. And this is really, I think when we were talking with Kareem, I can talk about this probably for 24 or 48 hours straight. There are so many opportunities here, and really the tough job is trying to figure out, okay, which opportunities to invest in. So I actually believe in the strong private and public investments. I think you learn a lot about themes from the private sector. And then the question is, okay, do I want to invest some capital here in the private sector and then also in the public sector? So that's kind of what I do with my investment strategy. First of all, you're talking about autonomous driving. Autonomous driving is so interesting because this is the future, right? Most of us own 2 to 3 cars. In the future, I strongly believe many of us will own about 1 car, and then we'll rely on some type of autonomous driving service to really take us from point A to point B. So I am looking at, different autonomous driving companies. I'm trying to figure out who's going to be the winner right now. You obviously have some strong acquisitions in this space. GM acquired Cruise. Cruise's technology is top notch. You have Ford and Argo AI, and you have Waymo, which again, I think those are really the top 3 technology in terms of and business models for the future. They have the partnerships with the traditional OEMs. Secondly, they have the technology from these startups that are recently acquired, and so they're integrating it. If you think of Tesla, I'm a huge bull on. But again, the question is, do you use LiDAR? Do you use a mix of cameras and radar? So really diving in, and if you like data, if you like analyzing which technologies you believe in. There's so many companies in this space right now, especially if you're just looking at LiDAR. There's Subton Technologies, which just recently went public. There's so many. And so for me, I'm just trying to figure out, specifically in the autonomous driving space, who I think will be a main winner here. And part of that is, and somebody else was talking about this earlier today, it's really the ecosystem. Who can build a strong ecosystem? Who can do it not spending the amount of capital that are needed on solid state lidars and mechanical lidars, but really doing it at a limited cost, right? You need those ecosystem of partners. And that's really key. What Tesla's doing is they're trying to do it all, which, if they can get it right and do the entire both vertical stack and horizontal stack, they will have an absolute advantage over any of the companies that I mentioned. Another interesting industry, and again, this just goes to show you how many industries there are, or sub-industries there are in the mobility space. I am very interested in the sorting and fulfillment space. And the question is, why? What does that have to do with mobility? Because mobility isn't just taking something from point A to point B. It's taking goods, it's the delivery of goods, services, people, land, air, sea, and other methods, right? So when you think about shipping just different items, Amazon, for instance, first thing, I learned about this a little while ago when I was doing some due diligence on this one startup. They've been holding this annual, I want to call it picking a sorting contest over the last, I think, 10, 12 years, where they invite all of these startups. And basically the whole contest is to pick an object, whether it's a package, whether it's a circular object, with these different types of hands. And the question is, can they not only pick it, but can they sort it, right? And if you can sort it, can you actually then use perception and imaging technology to define what it is? And all of these technologies are interrelated. So that also goes, if you're thinking about perception and imaging, this goes back to autonomous driving. That's another industry that I'm looking at, specifically the technology, and then seeing, okay, where does it overlay? Where can you actually invest in? Is it going to be in the autonomous driving space? Is it going to be in the robotics space, for instance? But again, I mean, there's so many, right? There's energy storage. There's even the used car market right now, which is going over, there's 3 main public companies right now that own about 80% of the market share. There's so many new startups in this space that actually are using data and AI algorithms to actually provide a better service. So there's all of these startups out there that most consumers haven't heard that I expect will continue to gain traction and will actually go public and take market share from these large players.
Right.
So
Without
I have
one of the most exciting industries out there, right, Kareem? I know that's what you were going to say too, right?
No, I was going to say, Sujoy, I have to stop you here because we'll go on and on. I want us to, we're waiting for Sid's here, Alex is here, but before we kick over from this panel to the next panel, Rumi, I do want to hear a little bit in terms of Outlier and what it is that you're looking for. What is it that you find exciting? that you've seen change over the last 6 to 8 months, and what you see happening over the next 6 to 8 months. Sid, Alex, forgive me. We're just a few minutes. Let's help Rumi close this out here.
Sure. Well, I guess my last 6 to 8 months has been informed by my last 6 to 8 years as well, because, you know, I kind of got into the blockchain space almost 8 years ago. And for the past 6 to 8 months, and actually I might say the past 6 to 8 weeks since 2021 started, for the first time actually in this space, in the blockchain space and its ancillary industries that it touches, I feel like the ground is below my feet. Before I almost felt like I was flying blind. I was okay flying, but now it's like my head is still in the sky, but my feet are on the ground. I'm really starting to see a lot of, and for me, what gives me the most hope is there's increasing amount of enterprise engagement, institutions now getting into this space. It used to be a career risk to go into Bitcoin. Now it's a career risk not to be in Bitcoin. Because people, I think, finally see the integration between traditional institutions and the possibilities here with digital innovation. So from the past 6 to 8 weeks, I guess it's less about the companies. I mean, there's so many different innovative ones that we've seen across gaming, mobility, smart cities, digital manufacturing. Sujoy, I loved your point around fulfillment. Stuff like that is just so critical. It's the infrastructure that makes all of our sexy dreams come true, right? Those guys need to be tended to as well. But I really, really appreciate now the more establishment focus on this industry, people not thinking of this as some dark web, Silk Road, grimy, corrupt thing. No, like this is really the direction of financial innovation now mixed with other types of industrial innovation, and seeing the enterprises get in and smart people get engaged and smart regulators get involved really makes me so happy.
Completely agree. And I would also just add, Kareem, and I know we have to go, additive manufacturing. That's something we didn't even talk about. 3D printing. This is all happening in the mobility industry. This is also happening with specifically with blockchain, which we can use. I talked about smart contracts very briefly, but again, I think we could talk about it more on the podcast. So it'll be fun.
Right. Yes. Yeah, again, another plug for the podcast. I think there's like 45 minutes, 60 minutes, and we got into some philosophy too. Right?
I agree. I agree with that.
No, I'd love to
check that out too.
Yeah, hit the podcast button on the left-hand side of the Global Investor Conference. You'll see it with Sujoy and Rumi. That was a great time. I want to plug. I want to ask you back for a Lunch and Learn, the link to Lunch and Learn, or another podcast where we can get more into this. And there's so many questions still flying about SPACs and mobility. We've got to talk about smart cities and all sorts of things. So thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Time. I feel always.
Kareem, for all those questions, why don't we answer them on the podcast? I know there's a bunch we didn't get the chance to answer, so it'll be
wonderful.
fun.
Good idea. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks.